Did some drawing yesterday of biogeochemical cycles. The hopefully very familiar water cycle with its above ground and below ground portion. And the much less familiar nitrogen cycle, which all really depends on bacteria, right? It's bacteria that get the nitrogen from the air, pry those molecules apart, and let plants use it to make those super important proteins and DNA. And then plants kind of give it to everybody else, right? The food webs all depend on plants, so that's how everybody else gets it. And then when stuff dies, it's denitrifying bacteria that get it out of living things and back into the atmosphere, and that's why we call it a cycle, right? It goes between living things and the atmosphere, this nitrogen does. So then we graph. And now let's talk about kind of real world applications here. You don't got to write this down. This was one of those scenarios we started with, right? Remember the farmers often spread huge, and this is true, just carpet bomb their fields with fertilizer. And guess what the three most common elements in fertilizer are? Anybody know? The numbers on the bottle, if you just use Miracle-Gro or whatever, it's called the NPK ratio. And it'll just be three numbers. And it tells you basically how much of the three elements it has.
I know one of them isn't one of them nitrogen and one of them like peroxide.
One of them is nitrogen, absolutely. That's the N of NPK. And what's P? This is all periodic table stuff, actually. Phosphorus. And then the third, K? It's one of the trick ones. Yeah. Did you say ketamine?
Is it like the letter K on the periodic table?
It is, yeah. Potassium, good. Good. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but of course we're thinking most about nitrogen, and it's usually the one that's present in the largest quantity of fertilizer. So a farmer is just spraying his fields with nitrogen, which is great for plants because there's something called the limiting nutrient. Basically, any living thing runs up against the thing that is keeping it from growing more, right? Well, in plants' case, it's usually one of those three elements. And so if you give it those three elements, your plants are going to grow bigger. That's the whole point of fertilizer. Problem is the water cycle. What happens when water hits the surface? Well, it can either go underground, but also there's that runoff, right? And runoff carries the fertilizer with it downhill into bodies of water. And so we got to talk about productivity to really understand this. Productivity in ecology is a term we use specifically. Primary productivity is a term we use for how fast the plants in that ecosystem can put on weight. In other words, how fast can they grow? How fast can they produce the stuff that everybody else eats? And limiting nutrient is the term we use for whatever it is that if you added it, productivity would increase. Basically, you're asking, what's the thing they ran out of first when they stopped, when they reached their maximum growth rate, that you could add and they would grow even faster? What's the limit they hit first? Was it how much water? Was it how much sunlight? Or was it something else? In most cases, the answer is it was something else. In most cases, the answer with plants is it was either nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium that they ran out of that put a lid on their growth rate. And if we add those three things, there's a pretty good chance they're going to grow even faster. So that's why fertilizers contain those three elements. because they work great. They increase growth rates of most plants. Problem again is when large flat farm fields get saturated with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then it rains, a lot of that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium gets carried into bodies of water, and the vegetation in bodies of water works differently in many ways than on land, but one of the ways it's the same is they need the same limiting nutrients typically. So what often happens, while you would think maybe that would be helpful for a body of water, it's not, because what gobbles up those limiting nutrients first is not helpful plants. It's algae, kind of proto-primitive plants. The first thing those algae do is just go nuts and coat the surface of the water. You've probably seen this. You've seen a green scummy pond before? Was it near a farm? Well, there you go. That's runoff, right? That's runoff carrying fertilizer into the water, and the algae gobbling it up. And that's a real bummer for those aquatic ecosystems because the algae aren't really supposed to be the producers for that ecosystem. There's producers underneath that are supposed to be getting light. And the algae usually goes nuts for a while, and then it reaches its growth limit and then starts to die. And when the algae die, bacteria move in to decompose it, and those bacteria suck the oxygen right out of the water, and everything starts to die because now you've got an anoxic, a body of water with no oxygen. Anybody been to Grand Lake St. Mary's in Salina, Ohio? That is like very relevant to that place. That's what has happened periodically to Grand Lake St. Mary's. The runoff has created huge algal blooms, and the place has gotten completely mucked up, partly because it's an artificial lake that's very shallow. So, it was easy to saturate with stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. It's partly the reason why you see, fountains in a lot of ponds around here is to keep the algae from growing. So that's your real life application of the nitrogen cycle, right? It's one of those things that everybody needs. Plants need it, and when you kind of mess with the balance of it, it can ruin ecosystems. All right, are you ready to play? Okay, we're going to play Are You Smarter Than a Harvard Graduate? You're going to need a half sheet of paper. So I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to answer it to the best of your ability, and then you will get to watch Harvard graduates trying to answer the same question that you just tried to answer on video. Ready? Here's the question. Trees start as seeds, right? We can agree on that? And the seeds weigh like hardly anything, a couple grams. And yet then years later, we get a tree that weighs tons. And the question is, specifically, what and where did this stuff come from to make all that mass? Where did the tree get that mass? Is the question. Got it? Okay. Well, I guess the bad news is that only a couple of you are smarter than Harvard graduates. The good news is none of you are any dumber. Most of you gave exactly the same answers that you're about to see them give. You ready?
Here's a seed.
Okay.
Okay? Now hold on to that for a second.
Okay.
Imagine that I planted that in the ground
Okay.
and a tree grew. All right? And here is a piece of that tree.
Sure.
Okay? Now where did all that stuff come from?
So where do plants come from? These beautiful big redwood trees, these great spreading valley oaks. And you know they start from this little tiny seed. It's miraculous. Where does all that weight come from?
The mass come from a lot of things, I'd guess. I'd guess from water that it sucked up from the ground. I would guess from minerals that it sucked up from the ground.
Water, light, soil.
Well, I suppose in terms of raw mass, most of it's probably derived from actual matter in the soil itself, and some of it comes from water, obviously, but a large amount of it comes from the nutrients that the roots absorb from the soil.
Now what would you say to
How many of you, raise your hand if that's pretty much the answer you gave? Yeah, that's the normal, that's what most people think that mass comes from. It's not. It's weird that that's not it, right? Okay, let's find out and watch Harvard students actually argue with the right answer.
someone who said to you that most of the weight of the tree came from the carbon dioxide in the air?
I would say I would have no idea. I'd have to think about that.
I would disagree because this same volume of air wouldn't weigh this much unless it was highly compressed.
That's very disturbing, and wonder how that could happen.
It's a very strange idea that somehow the air, which they view as nothing, as weightless, as insubstantial, somehow makes a tree, a giant tree that weighs several tons. I mean, it's absolutely incredible.
That'd be hard to believe because carbon dioxide is, well, it's a gas, and it doesn't seem intuitive that you could add mass taking in a gas.
But that's where it comes from. It takes those carbon molecules and packs them together via chemical reactions so tight that you get this huge mass.
By the way, that is a movie that was made basically about the fact that once you get a scientific misconception in your head, it's really hard to get rid of. You basically have to learn to think around it your entire life. So yeah, it's air. It's carbon dioxide in the air. That's where the mass comes from. Yes, some of the mass is water. Some of every living thing's mass is water. But the living mass, the stuff that makes up the solid mass of a tree, came from carbon dioxide. So now we need to look at the carbon cycle. A good way to think of this, by the way, that I enjoyed when a teacher of mine said this, is this. Trees are solar-powered machines that turn air into wood. In a very real sense, that is true. So, carbon cycle, leave yourself a bunch of room because it's kind of big. Again, we will start in the air because CO2 is kind of key to this process. And if you remember the nitrogen cycle, bacteria were the key to unlocking nitrogen. In this case, your first guess is the right answer. Plants, in the case of the carbon cycle, plants are the key to getting carbon out of the atmosphere. They're really the only, that's not true, they're not the only ones who can do it. Some bacteria can do it. Some single cell, what we call protists, can do it, but plants make up the modern day bulk of photosynthesizers on the planet, so it's pretty much them. The equation, chemical equation, at least a version of the chemical equation for photosynthesis, is what you see down low there on the box. CO2 plus water, right? Carbon dioxide plus water, plus energy from the sun yields glucose and oxygen gas. The carbon goes into the glucose. We'll learn to balance that equation when we do our photosynthesis chapter. But that's the basic idea, that plants get carbon from the atmosphere and build sugars with it. Then everybody else gets their carbon from the food webs that plants are the base of. And everybody else, including plants, uses the sugars for energy, right? And that process is kind of the reverse of photosynthesis. It's called cell respiration. And you'll notice its equation is almost exactly the reverse of the photosynthesis equation. Kind of like the water cycle, though, this cycle has an above ground and a below ground portion. Just like there's this kind of reservoir of groundwater in the below ground portion of the water cycle, there's a reservoir of carbon stored underground in the earth. And that's because every living thing that is based on carbon, as we all are, we are carbon-based life forms, every living thing dies. Happy Tuesday. But when they do, most of their nutrients get recycled, right? Bacteria chop off the nitrogen and put it back into the atmosphere. And some of the carbon goes back too. Of course, some of it gets eaten by other organisms, but some of it doesn't. Some of it gets deposited in the soil by the decomposers. And that stuff builds up. Has been building up for 3.7 billion years since the very first living things existed on Earth. And there's only certain ways that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere as CO2. There's only certain ways it gets back. One of those ways has been greatly accelerated by humans. Burning stuff, not just underground reserves like fossil fuels, although that's a huge contributor, but also burning things like wood releases tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, along with some other gases. Carbon monoxide as well. Naturally, volcanoes put a lot of carbon into the air, as well as some of those bacterial decomposers doing the same thing. And that's what kind of completes that carbon cycle that's been going on for as long as living things have been alive. This, however, is a good time to point out that humans have affected the carbon cycle pretty profoundly in the last 100 years. In the last 100 years, basically, a lot of the carbon reserves that have been building up for those 3.7 billion years, where most of the Earth's carbon used to be down there below ground, have been moved. Because humans, being humans, we kind of built our society around burning stuff. And the most efficient stuff for us to burn to get energy from has been fossil fuels. And so we've gotten very good at extracting coal, oil, and natural gas and using it to power things. And in the process, we have moved a large portion of the Earth's underground carbon up to this part of the cycle. And so there's way more carbon in the atmosphere now than there used to be, and less underground. We'll talk about effects of that in chapter 6. All right, I think that is good for a Tuesday. I'm going to give you a little chart to kind of compare the 3 biogeochemical cycles that you have studied. All right, so take a look. It's basically the 3 columns are the 3 cycles: nitrogen, water, and carbon. And the 3 rows ask you the same question of each cycle. What organisms are involved? In other words, what living things did we have to talk about in order to talk about each of these cycles? What geological and chemical processes are involved? That is, processes that don't involve living things, like evaporation, right? Evaporation from water because of the sun does not involve living things, so that's a geological process. Whereas then there's biological processes, things that are done by the process done by living things. And a good example of that is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a part of the cycle that is performed by living things, so it would go in that row under the carbon cycle. Got it? All right. Get to work. You got